The sound came quietly, at first just a few critical statements from Washington carried across news headlines like a distant alarm. But within hours, those words sharpened into something louder, something unmistakable. American officials were openly mocking South Africa's G20 summit, calling it the G100, suggesting that the gathering had become crowded, chaotic, and unfocused simply because South Africa dared to invite 42 additional nations, many of them from Africa and the Global South. For millions of ordinary Africans watching from Johannesburg, Cape Town, Lagos, Nairobi, and villages scattered across the continent, those comments felt familiar. It was the old world speaking again, the world where power was small, exclusive, and guarded. And yet this time, something was different. South Africa did not bow, apologize, or retreat. Instead, President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped forward with a calm but unmistakably firm voice. His message was simple: this is Africa's moment, and Africa will not be spoken down to. For the first time in history, the G20 is being hosted on African soil. The stakes are enormous. For decades, global decisions about economics, trade, energy, and security were made in rooms where Africa was present only as a statistic, never as a stakeholder. This year, South Africa vowed to change that, and they did it by widening the table rather than guarding the door. So the question for all of us, especially for those of you following world affairs closely, is this: what does it mean when a nation from the Global South refuses to shrink itself to fit someone else's expectations? And are we witnessing the beginning of a new balance in global leadership? If you believe that fairness must guide the future of global decision-making, if you believe that Africa's voice matters not tomorrow but today, then stay with me. This story is bigger than headlines. It is about dignity, inclusion, and the long-awaited rise of a continent long underestimated. Please stay tuned, and if you care about truth more than noise, consider subscribing and sharing this message. The murmurs began long before the speeches. In the streets of Johannesburg, ordinary shopkeepers, taxi drivers, and office workers were hearing the same thing on their radios. The United States had taken issue with South Africa's decision to expand the G20 guest list. It wasn't just a formal objection, it was a public scolding. Commentators in Washington suggested that by inviting 42 additional nations, South Africa had transformed a major global summit into something messy, diluted, even unserious. Some American officials went further, joking that it now looked more like a G100 than the G20. For many Africans, that criticism felt like a familiar echo from the past. In the old world order, only a handful of nations were trusted to shape global decisions. Everyone else, especially Africa, was expected to quietly accept whatever came out of those closed rooms. But this time, South Africa held the presidency of the G20. And this time, the summit would take place not in Tokyo, not in Rome, not in Berlin, but on African soil. That alone already carried symbolic weight. President Cyril Ramaphosa understood exactly what that moment meant. Just 3 days before the G20 Leaders Summit, he gathered African heads of state, business leaders, and civil society to make something absolutely clear: this would not be a traditional G20. This would not be a gathering where Africa sat politely at the edge of the room. This summit, he said, must finally reflect the world as it is, not as it once was. In his address, Ramaphosa reminded everyone that the G20 nations represent roughly 80% of global GDP. For decades, they had debated issues affecting Africa without Africa being truly present. When we assumed the G20 presidency, he said we declared that Africa must be at the center of deliberations. That declaration was not symbolic, it was strategic. The African Union had just secured full membership in the G20 thanks largely to South Africa's persistent campaign. Ramaphosa wanted the global community to understand Africa was no longer asking for a seat at the table. Africa was bringing its own chairs. The decision to invite 42 additional countries was not a spontaneous gesture. It reflected a shift underway across the Global South, a growing demand for inclusive decision-making. Nations in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East had long complained that global governance structures were outdated, built in an era when their voices were neither sought nor respected. South Africa aligned itself with this sentiment, arguing that tackling global crises, climate change, debt, energy supply chains, requires participation from everyone affected, not just the wealthiest. Ramaphosa went on to outline the philosophy behind his G20 presidency: solidarity, equality, sustainability. He even said he wished they had added a fourth word: inclusion, because in his view, nothing mattered more than ensuring that all parts of the world were seen and heard. He explained how South Africa had opened its G20 not only to governments, but to journalists, civil society, business organizations, and working groups like the B20. In fact, a G20 media declaration had just been adopted by reporters from 19 countries, covering press freedom and the safety of journalists, topics often overlooked in global forums. From there, Ramaphosa shifted to the economic reality behind the politics. South African companies, he said, have long operated across Africa, sometimes entering markets considered too risky or too unpredictable by Western investors. He shared a story from his time as chair of MTN, the telecommunications giant. When MTN invested heavily in Nigeria, many critics insisted the company had lost its mind. But the decision became a turning point in African corporate expansion, proving that African markets were not only viable, but profitable when approached with respect and vision. All of this set the stage for the core message: South Africa's expanded G20 was not a mistake, not a miscalculation, not a breach of diplomatic norms. It was a necessary correction. A world defined by interdependence cannot be governed by exclusion. A continent of 1.4 billion people cannot remain a spectator in discussions about global growth. And as Ramaphosa spoke, the mood in the room shifted. Those present understood that this summit, mocked by some, doubted by others, had already achieved something remarkable. It forced the world to confront a new reality. Africa was no longer waiting to be invited. Africa was already here. The turning point did not arrive with fanfare. It came quietly in a single sentence that carried the weight of an entire continent's frustration and its hope. As President Cyril Ramaphosa stood before business leaders, ministers, and African heads of state, he paused, looked up from his prepared notes, and said the words that would ignite the room: "Our G20 is about inclusion. We will not apologize." For a brief moment, there was silence, one of those rare charged silences in which everyone present understands they are witnessing a line that will be remembered. And then the room erupted. Business leaders clapped, ministers nodded vigorously, representatives from the African Union rose to their feet. It was not just applause, it was release, it was pride. It was the sound of people who had waited decades to hear a leader say openly what they had always felt privately: that Africa deserves more than a symbolic invitation to global decision-making. It deserves real presence. This was the emotional peak of the entire event. Ramaphosa's words were not only a rebuttal to Washington's mockery, they were a declaration of Africa's self-worth. For many older Africans watching from home, people who had lived through colonialism, the struggles of independence, and decades of uneven partnerships with global powers, that moment struck a deep chord. It was a recognition of the long journey from being spoken for to finally speaking for themselves. But while the applause filled the hall in Johannesburg, the reaction abroad was far more divided. In Washington, officials doubled down. Their message was unmistakable: G20 must remain streamlined, efficient, and focused. Inviting more countries, especially dozens of developing nations, was, in their view, a distraction that diluted the influence of established powers. Political commentators repeated the phrase G100 across major networks, turning it into a shorthand critique of what they saw as South Africa's overreach. Behind the jokes, however, there was something more serious: a concern that the old balance of influence was shifting, and not in America's favor. Yet outside the West, something very different was happening. In Latin America, leaders quietly expressed approval, noting that they too often felt sidelined in global forums. In Southeast Asia, analysts pointed out that the problems of the 21st century: climate disasters, supply chain disruptions, energy transitions, could no longer be solved by a handful of wealthy nations. In the Middle East, commentators praised South Africa for breaking the exclusivity that had long characterized Western diplomacy. Across the global South, the message was consistent: this is what leadership looks like. Back in Johannesburg, the energy in the hall kept building as Ramaphosa laid out the practical implications of this new expanded G20. He spoke of deepening trade ties within Africa, of strengthening continental value chains, of ensuring that investment flows no longer bypass African industries. The message resonated especially with the business community, many of whom had decades of experience navigating African markets in ways foreign firms simply could not. The African Union's reaction added another layer of significance. For AU representatives, this moment was historic. After years of petitioning, Africa finally had a permanent seat in the G20, an achievement made possible largely through South Africa's diplomatic campaign. When Ramaphosa reminded the audience that the AU was now represented in the same way the European Union had long been, the hall erupted once again. It felt as though a door had opened not just for South Africa, but for 55 nations whose voices had long existed on the margins of global governance. The private sector, too, responded with enthusiasm. CEOs from telecommunications, mining, manufacturing, and finance declared their support for an inclusive G20. They saw opportunity, not chaos, in a broader forum. For them, Africa's economic future depended on being integrated into global supply chains, energy markets, digital transitions, and investment flows. An expanded G20 could accelerate that integration. Through it all, Ramaphosa's tone remained steady. He was not defensive, nor was he confrontational. He was resolute. His words signaled a new level of confidence on the continent, a readiness not only to participate in the world, but to help shape it. By the end of his speech, one thing was clear. This was no longer simply about a guest list. It was about dignity, representation, and a continent insisting that its voice be heard in rooms where its future is decided. When the applause quieted and the conference lights dimmed, the true weight of South Africa's stance began to take shape, not in the meeting hall, but out in the neighborhoods, the markets, and the business districts where ordinary people were listening with cautious optimism. In the townships and suburbs of Johannesburg, people spoke about Ramaphosa's declaration with a sense of long-delayed recognition. For many older South Africans who lived through the transition out of apartheid, the message of inclusion carried a deeper resonance. It meant being seen by the world not as beneficiaries of aid or subjects of outside judgment, but as partners in building the global future. Among the younger generation, the entrepreneurs, engineers, and students, the reaction was practical and forward-looking. An inclusive G20 signaled broader opportunities, new markets, more investments, more pathways to take African-made products and innovations to the world. As South Africa's government emphasized the strategy of Gateway Africa, ordinary citizens began imagining how this could reshape local industries. It meant stronger supply chains, more stable markets across borders, and a future in which African businesses traded primarily with each other rather than relying almost exclusively on Europe, America, or China. Politically, however, the consequences were more complex. South Africa's firm stance signaled a shift in continental leadership, one that some global powers found uncomfortable. Washington's criticism, though framed as concern for G20 efficiency, was understood by many African commentators as an expression of deeper anxieties. If Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia began asserting themselves through multilateral platforms, the traditional balance of power would be altered. This also created an unusual pressure on South Africa's domestic political landscape. Ramaphosa's government had faced years of internal criticism for economic stagnation, power shortages, and governance issues. Yet, by demonstrating decisive leadership on the global stage, he temporarily strengthened his political position at home. The public response to the improvements he announced: better electricity supply, port reforms, credit rating upgrades, and the country's removal from the FATF gray list, was more hopeful than skeptical. People saw the possibility of an upswing even if the road remained difficult. Within the continent, South Africa's stance generated both admiration and expectation. Leaders from Kenya, Senegal, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nigeria expressed support for the larger vision of Africa, speaking with one voice. But that support came with a responsibility. South Africa would now be expected to follow words with action. African nations wanted more than symbolic gestures. They wanted South Africa to help improve investment flows, ease regional trade barriers, and support the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The business sector also faced its own set of expectations. Companies operating across the continent were encouraged to reinvest more deeply in African manufacturing, processing, and innovation. For decades, African economies had been trapped in a cycle of exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. A more inclusive G20 could help change that, but only if African companies were willing to lead the transformation. There were risks as well. The United States remained a major trading partner, a key investor, and a significant diplomatic actor. A prolonged disagreement over the nature of the G20 could spill into other areas of cooperation, affecting trade benefits, security partnerships, or political alliances. Some analysts worried that if the rift deepened, South Africa could face subtle economic pressure. Yet, for most people watching across the continent, the potential benefits outweighed the risks. To them, South Africa's stand was not merely political, it was symbolic of a broader awakening across Africa, one that echoed from Dakar to Nairobi and from Lagos to Addis Ababa. In the end, the civil and political consequences of this moment reached far beyond the G20. It became a referendum on Africa's place in the world, its dignity, its capacity, and its right to shape global affairs on its own terms. From the American perspective, South Africa's expanded G20 looked less like innovation and more like disruption. In Washington, policymakers repeated a familiar argument: the G20 works best when it is small, predictable, and controlled. Adding dozens of new countries, many from the global south, seemed to them like introducing uncertainty into a system that already struggled to reach consensus. Behind the public remarks about efficiency, however, many analysts saw something deeper, a concern that the United States was losing its ability to shape global discussions as decisively as it once did. For decades, American influence in institutions like the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and the original G20 rested on the idea that global governance required leadership from the wealthiest nations. But now, with Africa's population expected to reach 2.5 billion people by 2050, and with the continent rich in minerals, energy resources, and new markets, that old model was beginning to show cracks. The U.S. instinctively resisted this shift not out of malice, but out of habit. Great powers are rarely comfortable when others demand a larger share of the conversation. American commentators on television framed South Africa's actions in two ways. Some described it as admirable, a bold move reflecting a rising global South ready to stand on its own terms. Others called it naive warning that expanding the G20 would weaken its influence and fracture its unity. But what united both sides was a recognition that a transformation was underway and that Africa was no longer content with symbolic participation. In Europe, the reactions varied. French and British analysts expressed irritation that they were now being outnumbered by countries outside their traditional spheres of influence. Germany and the Nordics, meanwhile, adopted a more pragmatic view, acknowledging that if global challenges affect every continent, then every continent deserves a seat at the table. The European Union, which has always enjoyed permanent representation in the G20, suddenly had to confront the fact that Africa, through the African Union, now did as well. China and India, in contrast, reacted with quiet approval. Both countries had spent years cultivating political and economic ties across Africa. To them, a more inclusive G20 represented an opportunity to strengthen partnerships, expand trade, and counterbalance Western influence. Beijing, in particular, saw South Africa's move as aligning with its own long-term vision of a multipolar world, one in which global power is distributed rather than concentrated. Russia also saw strategic advantage. With Western powers increasingly isolating Moscow on the global stage, the rise of African participation offered new diplomatic openings. Within African capitals, Russian analysts framed South Africa's decision as a natural step toward decolonizing global governance. Even in regions far from Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, the shift was welcomed. Leaders there understood the feeling of being excluded from elite global forums. To them, South Africa's insistence on broader representation felt overdue and necessary. They argued that global decisions about energy, climate, migration, and supply chains could not be made effectively if large parts of the world remained voiceless. Yet, the most important perspective may have come from within Africa itself. Nations across the continent viewed South Africa as having crossed an important threshold, no longer petitioning for influence, but exercising it. For countries like Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, where debates about sovereignty, dignity, and global position have become central, South Africa's stand at the G20 offered a powerful example of agency on the world stage. Africa News and other regional outlets highlighted this moment as proof that Africa could no longer be sidelined in discussions about global economics or geopolitics. In the end, the global reaction, supportive, critical, anxious, hopeful, reflected one undeniable truth: the world is changing. And the center of gravity is slowly, steadily shifting toward places that were once overlooked. As the conversations in Johannesburg drew to a close and the evening lights settled across the city, one truth became impossible to ignore: something fundamental had shifted. A continent long spoken for had finally spoken for itself. But with every historic turning point comes a sober reality. Moments like these are fragile. They can spark renewal, or they can provoke resistance from those who feel the ground beneath them beginning to move. South Africa's bold decision to widen the G20 table has already created ripples far beyond diplomacy. It forces the world to confront an uncomfortable question: can global leadership still function if it refuses to evolve? If the old powers resist change, if they cling to exclusive structures built in another era, we may find ourselves facing deeper fractures in the international order. And yet, moments of tension often reveal deeper possibilities. From Nairobi to Dakar, from Lagos to Ouagadougou, citizens are now asking whether this new spirit of self-assertion could spread across the continent. Some point to the example of Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, another leader who insists that Africa cannot wait for permission to define its own destiny. His message about sovereignty, dignity, and economic independence mirrors the same sentiment South Africa brought to the G20 stage. Africa News and other regional outlets have noted the symbolic power of seeing multiple African nations demanding respect on different fronts, each reinforcing the other. But with this new momentum comes a warning. Moments of awakening can lose their force if not followed by practical action. G20 inclusion will mean little if African nations cannot strengthen their own industries, deepen regional trade, or speak consistently with one voice. Likewise, global institutions will only take Africa seriously if Africa continues to show unity and purpose values that cannot be demanded, only built. For viewers in the United States, especially those who have lived long enough to witness multiple chapters of global transition, the question now is not whether Africa is rising, but whether the world is ready to rise with it. You have seen the Cold War reshaped alliances rewritten and new powers emerge from places once ignored. You know better than anyone that history rewards those who adapt and punishes those who resist change. So let me leave you with this. Do you believe global institutions like the G20 are finally ready to treat Africa as an equal partner? And should leaders such as President Ibrahim Traoré push even harder to secure Africa's rightful place in the world? Your voice matters more than ever. Please share your thoughts in the comments, your perspective, your concerns, your hopes. If you believe Africa deserves a seat at every global table, if you believe truth should matter more than headlines, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can help bring clarity to stories the world too often overlooks.